Hey ladies, sorry I couldn't be with you today. I've got a little sick kiddo, so instead, these are your honors bio sub-day sketch notes. So just as a refresher for block one and as kind of a beginner for block two, I want to talk a little bit just about our card sort activity and how we had a bunch of different organisms and we were taking a look at them and just trying to decide maybe how we could possibly categorize or classify them. Turns out life is really diverse and there's a ton of different organisms and there's a ton of different ways of thinking about how to fit them into groups or how to talk about these organisms. And when we looked at the cards, if we flipped them over, they had just a wealth of information. Things like the type of cells, are they eukaryotic or prokaryotic? Do they have a cell wall or no cell wall? Also the idea of energy, how do they get their energy? Do they obtain it as a heterotroph or an autotroph? We also took a look at levels of organization, reproduction, and then also habitat. And when we took a look at these different characteristics, it became clear that there was a general way in which we could maybe possibly classify them. So we started kind of moving some of these organisms around and taking a look at some of them. And hopefully it's relatively apparent that we can essentially put them into just three groups. This group here would be the animals, this group here would be plants, and then this group over here would be fungi. And it is my hope that this is not something new. Ideally, this is something you probably have heard before when studying science in junior high. What I'd like to do is take just a few minutes to talk about these three main kingdoms and some of the important characteristics that they share or have slightly different. So, let's take a look. At this point, you're going to want to go ahead and pull out your section of sketch notes here. I took the liberty of go ahead and filling in just a couple of extra pieces. You may want to take a second, pause the video, and just make sure that you have these pieces filled in or that you know what they should be. So our argumentation, things being non-living, we're going to return to this idea of purpose of classifying after we've talked a little bit more about classification. And then we have our scientific writing, that APA format. Later today, if you have a little bit of time after completing other activities, you will actually be looping back and hopefully having time to write your paper. So what I'd really like to take a look at then is how diverse do you think living organisms are? And this is kind of the first part of our card sort activity. And as I previously mentioned, there are essentially three main kingdoms. And when I say three main kingdoms, I should say that with a bit of a disclaimer. There are three main kingdoms from that particular card sort activity that we just did. We'll be building on this idea and adding to this idea of kingdoms as we go along, but this is just from the card sort. All right, so if we take a look, as I mentioned, we have that category of animals. And when I think of animals, I always think of pets. One of my little near and dear favorite pets that is at least relatively easy to draw would be my parents' dog. He's so cute. Okay, so we have animals. In addition to that, we could also talk about plants. And maybe this is a little flower plant. And then the last category that was in those little cards that we just looked at would be fungus. And out of all three of these, my guess is fungus might be the one that you are slightly less familiar with. There's my little picture of a mushroom. Also very cute. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to take a look at some of the characteristics that came up on the backs of the cards. And I had mentioned earlier that there were a bunch of different things that we could have potentially looked at. Things about cell type, cell wall, how they obtain energy, reproduction, some of those other things. So I'd like to take those pieces and take a closer look at those now. All right, now this might require just a little bit of explanation. So I have this really nice, pretty blank page that is yours for your doodle note pleasure. To give you an idea of how I plan to utilize this space, I'm going to have my main idea, which for us is going to be kingdom characteristics. And then from this one main idea here, I'm going to be dividing the paper essentially into 6 different pieces. So I'll have 3 across the top and 3 across the bottom. And just keep in mind there's one section on the bottom that needs to be a little bit larger. There's a little bit more to add and draw to that particular section. So to start us out then, we are going to take a look first at this idea of how organisms are organized, or levels of organization more specifically. So number one, first thing we'll look at is organisms that are unicellular. So I'm going to draw a little cell here. And that prefix uni, if you remember from hopefully previous classes, uni means one. So we are literally talking about organisms that are just simply made of one cell. That could be things like a little protist, a couple other things, amoeba, certain other very small microscopic organisms. Conversely then, we could also talk about organisms that are multicellular, us for example, being multicellular. And that idea of multi simply meaning many. So these organisms are going to be composed or made up of many cells. Okay, so there's essentially our first little grouping here. First characteristic, cellularity. All right, so the next one that I want to talk about then is this idea of having a backbone. This was something that we saw on the cards specifically for organisms in the animal kingdom. So for example, the very first one that we'll talk about is vertebrate. And the idea of being vertebrate simply means that this organism is going to have a backbone. So when I was trying to decide what to draw to help me remember, it was all about the backbone. There's my little fish, in case you're wondering what that is. But this is an organism with a spine or backbone. Conversely then, or the opposite of that, would be an invertebrate. And for invertebrates, I always like to think of these little guys. They're so cute. Snails. These are going to be organisms without a backbone. Okay, so there's another characteristic, this idea of do they have a spine or do they have a backbone? Okay. Number 3 that we will talk about simply deals with this idea of what kind of habitat do they have. So for example, an organism could be aquatic. And here you get my adorable little guppy goldfish picture. He's got some bubble action going on there. He's a happy little fish. And aquatic organisms are simply water-dwelling organisms. The opposite then for that would be terrestrial. And that would be our land-dwelling organisms. And my picture for this one, cute little person. Okay, so there is a little bit of organization or classification based on where we can find them or what kind of habitat they maintain. All right, now I want to give you a little bit more of a heads up here for this last section, what this is going to look like for us. So number 6 is going to be over here. We'll talk about what that is in just a moment. Okay, but if you're looking at how to divide it, right about here is good. And then this next section is going to be a little bit smaller. We're going to squeeze it in here, that skinny little section. This will be number 5. And then we'll back it up all the way over here to number 4. I tried to do these in an order that was read left to right. So 1, 2, 3. Down here we'll move to number 4. All right, so characteristic number 4. This one's a little bit longer. There's a little bit more writing that goes with this particular one, just as a little bit of a heads up. Okay, this characteristic is called symmetry. My idea is hopefully you have heard of this before. If you're taking geometry, perhaps this is very familiar. And this simply deals with the orientation of an organism based on a plane or around an axis. And I'll give some examples and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. Okay, so unfortunately I feel like that's a lot of words, but maybe a good definition to have. Symmetry is the orientation of an organism based on the plane or around an axis. So the first one we're going to draw, and I do recognize some of these are a little more challenging to draw. You can draw some more simple shapes. I've obviously practiced some of these so that I could draw them at least passably well for you. The first one we're going to talk about is going to be this idea of radial symmetry. Radial symmetry. So if I were trying to look at this little hydra, for example, a little aquatic organism, and I were to divide this out around this center plane, you will notice that this organism, if better drawn, tends to be symmetrical radially from that center point. Now, if you don't feel like you can draw that hydra passably well, I would recommend that you draw a circle. Simply just a plain old circle, that'll show radial symmetry. So, radial then is just going to, as the name suggests, radiate out from the center. All right, and we will actually pick up with the next two in the next video, so stay tuned.